Today on Off the Clock, we are going to be talking about lessons learned from Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's recent time off work. When can an employer require employees to tell them when they're not going to be working? And how might we prevent a situation like this? Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice.
Can you just tell me what happened with Secretary Austin? Because I bet a lot of people were not nearly as intrigued as you and I
As
were.
us employment lawyers?
Right. We're
Yes.
like, let's see his attendance log. I want to see the call-in sheet. Where's the policy?
Did he call Joe or not?
But
That's
some
what I
people,
wanna know.
let's be honest, most people don't know the names of the Supreme Court justices. Most people do not know the name of Defense Secretary Austin or what happened.
Well,
so
to be honest, before this, I didn't know his name either. So until I saw it on the morning news. So, okay, yeah. So Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is obviously Secretary of our country's Defense Department.
Okay.
He's head. He's top.
that sounds like an important job.
It is. I would think it's an important job, more important than my job or your job. I'm sorry to say.
Speak for yourself.
Yes. Yes, and so he's a member of President Biden's cabinet.
Okay.
Reports directly to President Biden. Okay. Unfortunately, Defense Secretary Austin was diagnosed with prostate cancer in early December, this past December. Apparently had surgery on December 22nd, was sent home the following day, and then experienced complications, was taken by ambulance and admitted to Walter Reed Medical Center with complications, was transferred to the ICU, etc. Great news. Secretary Austin is recovered. And his prognosis is very good. So on the health front, everything is, I shouldn't say just fine, but everything is okay with Secretary Austin.
So why was this in the news? I just
Yes.
don't, these sorts of things don't typically grab our attention,
That's
right?
exactly right. So here's the rub. Apparently, Secretary Austin didn't tell either his direct supervisor, President Biden, which just, it makes me chuckle to refer to President Biden as his supervisor, but
Can
there
we call
it
him
is.
his frontline
His
supervisor?
frontline supervisor, Joe Biden. He
Not
didn't,
only not the HR department.
yes, not
Because
only
as
the-
we know, sometimes there's a disconnect between frontline
between
supervisors
the frontline
and HR.
supervisor and the HR department. He didn't tell Joe that he had a health condition, much less was not going to be working because of it. Nor did he tell the person who reports directly to him, who is Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks. Okay. So he stopped working,
Right.
had a medical procedure, was under anesthesia, which in this particular case is relevant because he's in charge of our country's defense. And that means for some period of time, no one was in charge of our country's defense. And the only reason apparently that his frontline supervisor or the person who reported him found out about it is because he was readmitted to Walter Reed Hospital and it hit the news. Just as an aside, the Kathleen Hicks, who's the Deputy Defense Secretary, was asked to assume some responsibilities for him around the 2nd of January.
Okay.
Ironically enough, she was on a planned vacation in Puerto Rico. So she was in Puerto Rico and had to start helping. But she still wasn't told what was going on with him or that he was off work or why he was off work until January 4th.
So the White House, I had read that the White House found out on the news,
Yes.
like the rest of us.
Yes.
And I was thinking, that's like in our world for our clients seeing something on social media.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
why is this person on vacation in Hawaii? I thought they were working
thought they were
remotely this
working.
whole time.
Yes, yes.
From their
yes.
home, or a picture of someone in a hospital bed when you thought they were working on Facebook, right? You see it on Insta or Facebook or something.
I had the same thought. Yes.
This is like the White House version of that.
Yes, that's at a very, very high level. That's exactly right.
Right.
And it might make our listeners feel a little better to hear that when the media and others started asking questions like, don't you have some sort of policy in place for this? The answer was actually no. We don't. No one thought to have a policy in place to tell cabinet members what the process was or what the requirements are to inform their frontline supervisor that they are no longer working or that they're off work.
So we can laugh
Yes.
because what's you and I talked about it right away, right? Because as this was rolling out in the news, and only a few of us, people who are politically interested, and then employment lawyers,
Right.
were interested as it was playing out, because it was playing out on a much grander and more important scale, obviously, but exactly the way
It's
it does
the
for
same
so many
story
of our
that we've
clients.
heard. Yes, over
And we're going to
over
get to the
again.
policy thing because we love a good policy and talking about policies. But I bet, I mean, how many of our clients or our listeners have a policy that talk about when high-level exempt employees have to report their
Have to-
absences?
right, exactly. So
Right? So the fact that the White House did not either, I bet a lot of people are sitting there thinking, well, that's probably how I would answer as well.
yes.
Yeah.
So
We
let's
didn't-
just
we just thought it was assumed.
start at the beginning. Okay. This has caused people to scratch their heads and start thinking about this. So let's just start at the beginning, Rebecca. Can employers tell their employees that they have to provide notice when they are not working, when they're expected to be working and they're not? Can we do that?
Yes.
I would think so, right?
It's the shortest
This
answer I've
seems
ever
to be-
given to any question in my entire life.
For sure, right?
Yes, absolutely. I cannot think of an example where the answer would not be
Yes.
yes.
I asked that question out loud because in the subsequent news flurry, that question seemed to be getting asked a lot.
Yeah.
And I just want you and I to be very clear for our listeners that absolutely,
Yes.
you can tell your employees if you're supposed to be working and you are not working, you have to tell us that.
Yes, and the question seemed to come up, particularly in HR-related blogs and whatnot, articles I get sent with exempt employees,
Yeah.
right? And higher-level exempt employees in particular.
Yeah.
Can we really require them
To do that,
to
which we'll talk
tell us-
about more
Yeah.
in a minute.
The answer is just yeah.
Okay, so next question. This is what I saw come up next. But if it turns out they're not working because of a health issue, can we still require them to tell us they're not working?
Still a yes.
Still
Wait,
yes,
It
right?
doesn't really matter what the reason is. If we are paying you to work and you are not actually working, we should know.
Yeah.
Right? First of all, because we're paying you to do something you're not, but also there may be Secretary Austin's situation.
wars, for example, that are
The
ongoing.
country might be at risk.
Yes.
But obviously for most of our clients it's smaller issues. But there may be some positions where,
Right.
we really actually need to know. Right? If you are not at your desk, you are not going to be at your desk today or for a period of hours, we really do need to know. Yeah, absolutely.
If
And
you're
it
not
doesn't really matter what the reason is, we just need to know.
Okay. So let's go back to a point you made, because I started thinking about how does this happen? You and I have seen this happen gotten lots
Many
of phone
times
calls.
over the last
many
year.
times,
Many
right?
times.
Many times.
Yeah.
How does this happen? And I think there's three main ways that this happens. Some of them overlap.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's start with something you just mentioned, and that's exempt employees. Right? It is not uncommon for an exempt employee to stop working, not working, and the employer not to realize it.
Right?
Right?
I hope it's less common. We hear about it when it
Yes, that's a good point.
happens, but that's absolutely right. It's not automatic that an employer would know. when an exempt employee takes an afternoon or a week off.
Right, or an afternoon or a week.
Or a week.
I love
Or
that.
a month.
I love that. Well, especially
Or two.
for exempt employees, that right, who don't clock in and out, and most of them don't,
Right?
and who have job responsibilities that require them to be in different places,
Right?
like you and me.
right?
Right? If I were not in my office for a week, you wouldn't do a wellness check, I don't think. You would
Never.
think Sarah must be out taking depositions or giving a presentation, or maybe she's working from home. I'm sure she's doing something, right?
You should never count on me to do your wellness. Let's be clear. But absolutely, we have no idea where each other are on any given day. And just because someone's not at their desk means nothing to me.
Okay.
In our world. And I know that's true for other organizations as well.
One of the benefits of having an exempt employee is we're not tracking their every movement,
Right.
right? So how have you seen employers, or how would you recommend employers balance that concept with the idea that we don't want our Lloyd Austin to not be working for a couple of weeks before we realize it because we're watching the news?
Right. or Facebook or whatever.
Or
Our
looking on
world.
Facebook. Yes, exactly.
So first of all, just to clarify, with exempt employees, you're exactly right. Typically, most employers don't track their in and out
Yep.
times. But to be fair, they can. This is a question that comes up for me on a regular basis. They can.
Right.
It's just typically they choose not to.
Yeah.
Because it's a hassle.
Yes.
Right? And that's part of the trade-off, right? But under the law, you can require exempt employees to mark when they're in and out on a daily basis.
Okay.
But I understand, that's
Good
1%
point,
of the
right.
time that's happening, and the rest of the time it's not. So something employers can do is require a note be sent when someone's good, usually set an amount of time. We don't want to know when someone's off every 20 minutes or half hour when
Right.
they're exempt. Usually it's just a hassle, and we just don't need to deal with it. But you can set a minimum amount, right? 2 hours, 4 hours, full day, whatever it is, and let someone know. That's absolutely appropriate, particularly when there's PTO plans involved.
Yeah, and I do want
Right.
to talk about that for a second, right? But
Yeah.
to be clear, we could have a rule specific to exempt employees that
Yeah.
says if you are not working, if you're otherwise scheduled to work, right? You're not on vacation and you're
Right.
not working for more than a half a day, 4 hours a day, you have to let us know.
Right. Yep.
And I think that's good. I do think there's a gap there for many employers in their communications to employees. They have a general rule that mostly applies to non-exempt employees about having to
Right.
call into work if they're not going to be there, but there's often not something there for exempt employees.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and for non-exempt, remember there's multiple ways to keep track of time. Most employers choose a clocking in, clocking out
Right.
method. So we know.
Yeah.
They didn't clock in, we know. Right,
not
but with
working.
exempt, right, like
falls
we don't,
between
we
the
don't
cracks.
need someone to
Right.
tell us.
Okay.
I have in all the handbooks I've worked on a lot, I know you have too. I have seen very, very few that talk about exempt employees. And
I'm not sure I've seen any,
yeah,
to be honest.
it's few and
Notice
far between.
requirements like this, maybe one I could think of.
Right. Yeah. So when we all chuckled that there was no requirement, right,
Yeah.
for Secretary
This is what I'm
Austin
saying.
to
Nobody-
notify his
it's
frontline
not-
supervisor or HR,
It's not just the federal
that he
government.
was going to be out. Probably most people don't have that requirement.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's talk about PTO.
Okay.
Okay. Because here's what I've seen many times. Exempt employees accumulating accruing huge buckets of PTO, particularly if there's a policy that allows them to carry it over from one year to the next.
Yeah.
Because there is no requirement like this in place. So often they maybe aren't working, but we don't know.
Yeah.
And therefore, they're not required to use their PTO, and we're just continuing to pay their salary instead.
And then they leave.
And then they leave, and if the PTO policy says they get paid out at the end of employment, or if they're in a state that requires it, which
Yeah.
is the case in many states, then they get a huge bucket of PTO. So in my mind, that's an additional reason to have some sort of parameter, some sort of guardrails in place for your exempt employees. If you're
Right.
not working for more than 4 hours in a day, you have to let us know. And your PTO will apply.
There is a PTO plan for a reason, and we're not going to talk about this a lot today.
Yes.
This could be a whole nother episode. But for those listeners who are like, well, I just trust it, right? They're exempt for a reason. I
Right.
just want them to get their work done. We give them a certain workload as long as they're getting it done. I don't care
Right.
about any of it.
If they're working or not.
So some employers have gone towards, they call it unlimited PTO,
Oh, yeah.
but it's really no PTO plan, right? It's just,
Yeah.
we aren't keeping track. You don't have a certain allotment. Take what you need or want. Just
Right.
get your work done, and still inform us when you're on vacations. But so if this whole thing just makes people's skin crawl, that's an option that was trendy prior to COVID. I know, and then
I saw
everyone got
several of
distracted
those, yeah.
by COVID. So that how to work those plans and how to write them, we've done that. We're not going to talk a lot about that today. But if you have a plan with a specific number of hours that get paid out at the end of employment, you really do want to keep track of where people are and when they're using
Yeah,
it.
for your exempt employees. And
Yes.
and you can absolutely do that. Okay. So
Absolutely.
the next circumstance in which I see this happening, by this I mean employees aren't working and we don't know it. Do you have any guesses as to what I'm going to say?
Well, I know the number one for me,
Okay.
which is remote work.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. The remote workers, and I know our listeners just, some of them sat up a little bit when we
And to
said
be fair, everyone's worried about that. That's why remote work was not popular prior to COVID,
Yes.
right? And that's why after COVID, a lot of employers really wanted people back because there was a suspicion that people really weren't working that much. But to be clear, what we're talking about today is not people who are not as efficient, who are taking longer coffee. We're talking about people who are not working at
who have
all.
stopped working altogether.
Who have stopped
And not
working,
told us.
who are doing other things with their days, either working for someone else, which happens,
Which we've seen, yes.
right,
Yeah.
or full-time childcare or whatnot, but literally just not working
at all.
Right? Yes.
So it comes up definitely for remote workers.
Yeah.
And again, particularly for remote workers probably who are exempt.
More so because they don't have to clock in and out, right?
It's true for both, but particularly more so for exempt. So again,
Yeah.
if you have a remote policy, we would highly recommend having a clear expectation
Yes.
of when both exempt and non-exempt employees are supposed to provide you notice that they're not working.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. And I would just to add on there, yes, and please make sure you're following up at the first suspicion.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to people that have said, "Oh yeah, we've suspected this for 6 months now.
Right.
We just now have come to realize it's like don't let this go on
They're not actually
quite that long,
Right.
right? Where there's smoke, there's fire. I have found with this sort of thing, right? So you need to start requiring people to check in, right? Provide logs on what they're doing every day. Call them to see if they're there. There's technology that can help, monitor keystrokes, et cetera. But don't let it go on and on and on. If no one's responding to you for a month, please follow up.
wellness check perhaps, but yes, for
I'm not
sure.
going to do a wellness check, but maybe there are some other kinder people out there
Yes.
that would.
The third situation in which I've seen this situation come up is one in which an employee does take time off, say vacation time, but doesn't return from the vacation time. And the circumstances in which I've seen it come up again and again is they've taken vacation time, often for some sort of health procedure or concern, and not told the employer.
We think it's vacation.
We think it's vacation as far as we know it's vacation.
But it's really not.
So the situation, the most recent situation I had for a client was recent. An employee with a very physically demanding job scheduled a 2-week vacation. As it turns out, had a knee replacement. During the 2-week vacation. Employee, bless his heart, thought he was going to come back and do his job at the end of the 2 weeks. Didn't come back. It was unclear for some period of time why or what he was doing, as is often the case, right? There was a lack of communication back and forth. And then at the end of the day, he finally says, well, I actually had a knee replacement and it's not going as I thought, and now I'm going to be off work for X period of time.
I kind of feel bad for him. I know the client was
Yes.
probably annoyed, but
Yeah.
I feel bad for him if he thought a knee replacement was a 2-week deal.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where that communication went sideways. I didn't ask specifically.
2 weeks, you're just coming out of the anesthesia.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, in a situation like that, Rebecca, obviously there's other laws that we know and love that apply: the FMLA, the ADA, state-specific leave laws, etc. Right?
Right.
How does that change things for that employer? Can they still enforce a rule that the employee was supposed to tell them that they were going to be off?
Yes. Let's going back to where we started.
Yes.
My shortest answer of my life.
Still yes.
It's still a yes. I think what trips clients up in that moment when they are finally told, the reason
Yes.
is, oh crap. When someone's off
It's a health
for a
issue.
health
Yes.
reason, there are all sorts of things
Yes.
we're supposed to do and protections and
Right.
this and that, and we didn't do any of
We
that.
didn't send out the FMLA notice.
Right. The important thing to know is that all of these laws all have notice provisions. So everyone take a deep breath. We're not expected to be mind readers. When we have notice of a health condition, right, everything, right, should kick in, processes should kick in. Before we have notice, you will not be held responsible for not doing things that you would have done if you
Right.
had known. But on the day you have notice, that's your first day of notice, right? And you are, with one FMLA caveat that you might want to consider, you are forward thinking,
Yes.
right? You are from this day forward. Can we, if he can't come back, and for instance, a leave might be a reasonable accommodation. Let's just assume he's not eligible for FMLA for a moment, right? So we're in non-FMLA world. Can we accommodate an extended leave, right? Is there a specific return to all the things you do under your reasonable accommodation process when someone needs time off, but you don't have to think about beforehand, which includes if the person failed to give notice that they weren't working or not coming in that day, and it turns out it was because of a health condition, you didn't know, right? That you can still discipline or hold them accountable for that failure to follow your procedures.
Right. Assuming you have them. But yes. Yes. Yes.
Assuming-
hopefully there are procedures
Assuming
in
you
place.
have a procedure. Now, in the FMLA world, there may be a reason why you might want to look back retroactively.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yes. So, in a I'll just take that from there. By the
I was
way,
hoping-
because it's
Every time I say FMLA, I just assume you're taking
you're
the
just like
conversation.
throwing me the here's Sarah, here's the FMLA.
Yeah, take it.
I'm sorry. I just
You're like in far right field. It's mine. We didn't.
yes.
In case people think we actually practice these,
we do not.
we do not.
Yes.
All right, FMLA lady, take it away.
Yes, if this employee is eligible for FMLA and we find out after the fact that they've been off work for an FMLA qualifying reason, the knee replacement is a great example, right? That employee,
That's going to count.
that
right?
employee was eligible for FMLA.
Yeah.
At that point, that employer had a decision to make, frankly. Under the law, they could have denied the first part of that employee's time off work as FMLA leave. They could have said the FMLA doesn't apply because you didn't provide us notice of a need for FMLA leave. That's your point.
Right. You're not going to be in trouble for not allocating that time, not designating that
The
time.
employer would not be in trouble. Right. Exactly. However, there's some strategy here because we may want to designate it under the FMLA so that it comes out of their 12 weeks of FMLA entitlement.
Got it.
Right? If they're going to if at the end of the day, we're going to give them the job protection, which you probably are,
Right.
there's a benefit to just counting it from the first day that employee missed work. And yes, you could come back, you could go all the way back to the first day of that employee's quote unquote vacation.
Yep.
If you knew they were actually missing work. And yes, it's okay if there's an
Okay.
overlap
You
there.
can retroactively designate.
You
when
can
do.
retroactively designate in that case. let's take everything we just learned
Secretary Austin and his
to
frontline
Secretary
supervisor.
Austin and his frontline supervisor. Yes.
And Joe's such a great name for a frontline supervisor.
Yeah, it's Joe, the frontline supervisor.
Someone would totally call us with that, Lloyd and Joe.
Lloyd and Joe. Yeah, so let's circle back, take everything we just discussed, right? And Rebecca, you get a phone call from the frontline
Right.
supervisor, Joe.
Yeah.
And Joe says to you, can I discipline or can I fire this employee? I had no idea they were off.
Yep.
And it turns out they were not working during this time. But now I know the reason they were off was because of this health condition. What can I do about that?
I'm going to have two questions for you, Joe.
Okay.
One is,
I don't have a Joe Biden impersonation, so it's just going to be...
the resemblance is uncanny, though. So the first question is, do you have a policy that requires notice? And the answer
Right.
we already know is no,
no,
but
right.
I thought it was common sense. This
Right.
is often our question with discipline calls,
Yes.
right?
Right.
What's the policy? And well, isn't it just common sense? Yes. Okay. Second question is, how have we treated other employees in similar situations?
Right.
Because if we do, even if there's not been a written policy, if in other situations when people are, let's just say AWOL, when they go AWOL for any reason,
Yeah, not for health
including
reasons.
health, but for any reason, and we either discipline or terminate, that's the way we should handle this, even though we now know it's a health
Or
reason.
could, right.
Right?
Yes.
Like the fact that the reason is health should not be the determining factor, pro or con.
Got it.
Right?
Got
and
it.
or conversely, if people have gone AWOL in the past, but we do not discipline or terminate,
Right.
for whatever reasons, then we probably shouldn't do that. Here it could look like disability discrimination or FMLA retaliation, right? Once he
Agree
applies.
completely. Yes.
So those are the key factors. But yes, if others have been disciplined and terminated for similar issues, but it wasn't health related, they're just AWOL for hunting or right?
Yes.
Going on vacation
On
and never
vacation.
wanting to come home.
Yeah.
Then you can do the same here because it's not the health related condition that's causing the decision. It's
This
just the
employee-
fact that the person is AWOL.
Right.
I love using the term AWOL, by the way, for the Secretary of Defense.
It's not a good
Someone who could actually legally be AWOL.
look. It's not a good look. It's not a good look for our country.
No.
Anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so let's end with our favorite thing to talk about, which is a policy. We've sort of alluded to this, and I'll just say this out loud. I think, so my experience is that employers generally do a good job of having a notice requirement in place for that seems to be most applicable to non-exempt employees, and it's
Yeah.
usually part of some sort of attendance policy.
Correct.
If
It's
you're not
always
going
in
to
the
come,
attendance,
if you're not coming to work,
Right.
you have to tell us.
You get a point for
Here's
this,
how
a
you,
point
yeah.
for
Here's how
that.
you're supposed to tell us. Here's when you're supposed to tell us, etc.
Right.
But actually, an application that's not actually required of exempt employees, even though the policy might not make a distinction.
It rarely makes a distinction. I love how you said that. It rarely makes a
distinction, but in reality, we don't really require exempt employees to provide us notice, which leaves this hole, right? So that it's unclear when exempt employees are supposed to tell us they're not working. And maybe we want to apply the same rule, but I kind of doubt it. I don't think we want exempt employees to be calling us every morning and saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to be 5 minutes late, right? And so I think there is an opportunity here for employers to put something in writing about expectations with regard to exempt employees
Yes.
and remote employees as well.
It's got to include remote. I think as folks are listening to this, they're thinking most about their exempt remote employees.
Right.
Yeah, that's where the rubber hits the road,
Yes.
so to speak, and where we see people actually holding two jobs at the same time without either employer knowing and that sort of thing.
That's right. And to be clear, it could be okay to have a different notice requirement for exempt employees than we have for non-exempt employees and have a different policy in place.
You got it.
Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
This was fun.
It was
you.
very fun.
Okay.
Thanks, Rebecca. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.